Government secrets have been a topic of fascination for many of us, but it's more than just a conspiracy theory. It's a matter of life and death. The decisions made behind closed doors can have a direct impact on our daily lives, from the air we breathe to the water we drink. It's time to take a closer look at what's really going on. Lack of transparency is a major issue when it comes to government actions and policies. It's no secret that information is often withheld from the public, and it's not hard to wonder why. From classified documents to secret meetings, it's clear that there's a lot going on that we're not meant to know. Take, for example, the Pentagon's budget. Billions of dollars are spent on projects that are never disclosed to the public. What could they be hiding? The truth is, we may never know. Another classic example is the Freedom of Information Act. Sounds like a great way to get access to government information, right? Wrong, the act is so heavily redacted that most requests are denied or heavily censored. It's like trying to get blood from a stone. The government claims it's for national security reasons, but we can't help but wonder, what are they really hiding? On the morning of September 12, 2003, a marine biologist named Dr. Amelia Brooks stood at the bow of a research vessel about 40 miles off the coast of Western Australia. She was holding a specialized tracking beacon and watching as her team tried to wrangle a massive 3-meter female great white shark they had caught. The shark was thrashing wildly in the water, and the team was doing their best to keep it steady so she could attach the beacon. The beacon was a big deal for their team. It cost about $25,000 and could track all sorts of data. Media group, close-up of tracking beacon, scientific equipment on research vessel at stock, distribute _ equally the shark's location, its depth, and the water temperature around it. Pretty much everything. Dr. Amelia Brooks and her team had been trying for weeks to attach a beacon to a great white shark of this size. They had actually gone through 3 different sharks that were too small before finally finding this one. After about 25 minutes of struggling with the shark, they managed to secure the beacon onto its dorsal fin. The team then released the shark and watched as it disappeared into the water. Dr. Brooks was relieved that everything had gone perfectly. The beacon was now transmitting data exactly as it was supposed to. For the next 4 months, everything was great. The shark was doing typical shark things, swimming around its territory, diving for food, and following normal migration patterns. Every morning, Dr. Brooks would come into her office at the Marine Institute, pour her coffee, and check the data from the previous day. In fact, it had become such a routine that she barely paid attention to it anymore. But on January 23, 2004, as she sat at her desk looking at the previous day's data, she noticed something strange. The water temperature reading from the beacon had suddenly jumped from 7 degrees Celsius to 25 degrees Celsius. Before she could even process what that meant, the depth reading showed the shark had somehow plunged to over 500 meters in a matter of seconds. Frantically, she called over her research partner, Dr. Nathan Hughes, and showed him the readings. At first, they thought it was just the beacon malfunctioning, but then the signal completely stopped. 2 weeks later, a beach maintenance worker was doing his morning cleanup on a beach about 2.5 miles from where Dr. Brooks's team had originally tagged the shark. He found what looked like a piece of scientific equipment partially buried in the sand. It was their beacon. Shortly after, the team was reunited with the beacon, but everything about the situation was unusual. The beacon looked as if it had been bleached white, and there wasn't a single trace of algae growth on it, which made no sense for something that had supposedly been in the ocean for 4 months. The team couldn't explain how this had happened, but they were determined to find out. That night, Dr. Brooks stayed late at her office, going over the data again and again. A great white shark doesn't just vanish, and it certainly doesn't dive 500 meters in seconds. That's physically impossible for them. She was just about to pack up and head home when her phone rang. It was Dr. Hughes calling to tell her that the lab results had come back from the beacon analysis. The white discoloration they'd found wasn't bleaching, it was evidence that the beacon had been exposed to stomach acid, really strong stomach acid, the kind you'd find in the digestive system of a large marine predator. Amelia Brooks and her team wrote up their findings, but they had no real explanation for what had happened to their shark. The report was eventually filed away and forgotten until 2013, when something happened off the coast of British Columbia that made Dr. Brooks dig out that old report. On the morning of July 15, 2013, two commercial fishermen named Mike Reeves and Tom Paulson were on their trawler about 50 miles north of Vancouver. They were pulling in their morning catch when Tom happened to look over the starboard side and froze. He called Mike over and pointed out into the water. About 100 yards from the boat was a sperm whale, which was unusual enough to see in these waters, but both men noticed something else was happening to this whale. Something massive was attacking it. The fishermen could see this huge, dark shape moving around the whale. They noticed a tail that kept breaking the surface, and shockingly, according to Tom, the width of this tail fin was about the same as their fishing trawler. The two men watched the attack for 15 minutes until the water just went still. Immediately, they radioed the Coast Guard to report what they had seen. But before any vessels could arrive, they got another call about a whale carcass that had washed up on a nearby beach. When marine biologists arrived, they were met with the partial body of a sperm whale. The lower third of this whale had been removed, not torn off or ripped away, but cut off in one clean bite. Embedded in the spine was a tooth, a single tooth that was 7.5 inches long. For comparison, the largest great white shark tooth ever found was about 3 inches. Whatever had attacked this whale was capable of taking bites that were 2 to 2.5 meters wide. When scientists did calculations based on the bite radius and tooth size, they estimated this predator had to be around 30 meters long, or roughly 90 plus feet. After this, many marine biologists from all over the world began to pay attention, but for the next 6 years, besides some questionable photos and unconfirmed sightings, there wasn't any concrete evidence of a massive marine predator. That changed in March of 2019. A group of Australian fishermen radioed the Coast Guard about a dead great white shark they'd found floating about 20 miles offshore. When marine officials arrived, they discovered a 12-ton great white shark that had been bitten almost completely in two. The bite marks wrapped around the entire middle section of the shark. One of the officers on the scene later said that looking at those bite marks was like looking at a great white shark bite on a seal. Except this time, it was on a great white. Now, sharks do attack other sharks, and this is a known behavior. But the big deal here was just how large the bite was. It turns out there was a well-known great white shark that researchers had been tracking for years, a 4.5-meter female nicknamed Seafish. In June of 2019, a research vessel spotted Seafish near the surface and noticed something strange. She had a massive scar that ran from her pectoral fin all the way to her dorsal fin. Dr. Gregory Martinez, the lead researcher studying Seafish, took detailed photographs and measurements of the scar tissue. After analyzing the bite pattern and comparing it to known predator bite marks, he concluded that whatever had attacked Seafish had to be at least 9 meters long. A similar incident occurred near Briar Island in southeastern Canada, where partial remains suggested a predator of about 26 feet. There were even reports of a creature that had bitten a whale shark, with the bite radius suggesting something around 40 feet long. However, the largest confirmed great white shark ever recorded was a specimen nicknamed Dark Blue, which measured just over 6 meters. All of these incidents pointed to something much bigger, something hunting great white sharks the same way great whites hunt seals. Martinez began reaching out to other marine research stations around the world for unusual data. Interestingly, he came across Dr. Amelia Brooks' old report from 2003 about the tracking beacon. Blown away by what he read, Dr. Martinez flew to Australia to meet with her and examine the data. The two scientists spent 3 days reviewing everything: the depth readings, the temperature spike, and the condition of the beacon when it was found. Dr. Brooks even pulled out old photographs she'd stored in a filing cabinet. Pictures of the beacon before they attached it and after they found it. The difference was striking. They also uncovered a series of underwater recordings from a hydrophone array near where Dr. Brooks's shark had vanished. On the morning the beacon stopped transmitting, the hydrophones picked up an incredibly low-frequency sound. It was way below what any known marine mammal produces, lasted 45 seconds, and then stopped. While all this investigation was happening, fishing communities along the Pacific coast began reporting strange occurrences. Boats that had been fishing the same spots for generations suddenly couldn't find any fish. Commercial fishing vessels reported sonar readings of massive shapes moving through the water, too big to be whales. A fisherman named Jack Torres, who had been working boats for 30 years, explained that one morning, while checking his crab pots, his boat's depth finder showed something enormous moving underneath him. It was longer than his 85-foot boat. Panicking, he radioed other boats in the area, asking if they were seeing anything unusual. 3 other captains confirmed the same thing. By December of 2019, at the International Marine Biology Conference in Sydney, Australia, Dr. Brooks and Dr. Martinez presented all their findings to a room full of marine biologists and oceanographers. They laid out the evidence, the tracking data, the sperm whale attack, the bite marks on the great white sharks, everything. After finishing their presentation, Dr. James Wilson, one of the most respected marine biologists in the world, stood up and revealed something he had never shared publicly. Back in 1998, while conducting deep-sea research off the coast of South Africa, his team sent down an unmanned submersible to roughly 900 meters. The sub was equipped with powerful lights and multiple cameras to study deep-sea life. Dr. Wilson explained that on one of the camera feeds, they saw something move past the submersible. It was so large that it blocked out all their lights for several seconds as it passed. Although they only caught a glimpse, what they saw didn't match any known species. Based on the data, the creature was roughly 25 meters long, at minimum. At the time, Dr. Wilson chose not to report the sighting, fearing for his reputation and worried people would think he was chasing sea monsters. Minutes, the violent shaking and booming sounds continuing relentlessly. Marie Lambert clutched the armrests of her seat, her knuckles white as she tried to process what was happening. Her instincts told her this wasn't normal turbulence. It felt as though something external was interfering with the plane. Suddenly, as quickly as it began, the shaking stopped. The cabin fell eerily silent except for the faint hum of the engines. Passengers slowly released their grips on their seats, exchanging nervous, wide-eyed glances. Marie looked out the window again, but the sky was clear and there was no sign of the massive object she had seen earlier. Over the intercom, the pilot's voice came through, shaky but composed. "Pilot, ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the unexpected turbulence. We've adjusted our altitude and should have a smoother flight from here on out. Thank you for your patience." Marie noticed the other passengers nodding and murmuring in uneasy agreement, but her gut told her that the pilot knew more than he was letting on. She glanced at the man seated across the aisle again. He looked visibly shaken and was now staring out his window as though expecting to see something himself. When the flight finally landed in Ottawa, hours later, the crew and passengers were visibly relieved. Marie gathered her belongings, her mind still racing. She wanted desperately to ask someone, anyone, if they had seen the massive object or if they had experienced the same overwhelming fear she had during the shaking, but the NATO staff members around her were already preoccupied with their briefcases and schedules. For days, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Something had happened out there, and she couldn't believe no one else was talking about it. Finally, during a private lunch with her colleague James Carr, a senior NATO advisor, she decided to speak up. Marie cautiously recounted what she had seen through the window and the violent shaking that followed. To her surprise, James didn't look shocked. Instead, he leaned in closer and quietly asked, "James Carr, did you tell anyone else about this?" Marie shook her head. James nodded and sighed heavily. "James Carr, what you saw wasn't turbulence, and it wasn't your imagination. There have been other incidents, unexplained phenomena reported by pilots, military personnel and scientists. Most of it never reaches the public." Marie stared at him, speechless. Marie Lambert, "But what was it?" James hesitated, clearly choosing his words carefully. "James Carr, we don't know. Some call them unidentified submersible objects, USOs. They move through the water and the air in ways our technology can't. And whatever you saw, Marie, you're not alone." Over the years, Marie would occasionally come across similar stories, aircraft reporting unexplained shaking, sightings of massive torpedo-like objects, and strange disruptions over remote oceanic regions. While she never told anyone outside her trusted circle, she remained haunted by that flight across the Atlantic and the feeling that something massive, silent, and entirely beyond human understanding lurked in the depths below. She couldn't take it anymore. She quickly unbuckled herself and, in the violent motion of the plane, stumbled her way toward the front, grabbing a hold of the seats to steady herself. When she made her way to the crew area, she began calling out to ask what was happening, but found no response. She ripped the curtain right near the crew area and saw that one of the stewardesses was lying on a bed with her hands covering her face, crying. She didn't even acknowledge Sophia's presence. At this point, everything about the situation felt incredibly strange. It might not sound logical, but she felt an overwhelming urge to go back and sit in her seat. As she did so, she noticed she was sweating profusely, as if every pore in her body was working overtime. However, she could only handle sitting for a few minutes before she got back up again and started pounding on the cockpit door, demanding answers. Nobody answered for several minutes until a different stewardess finally came out. This woman gave Sophia a bizarre look, as though she was completely insane. The stewardess stood there in silence momentarily and then, in the most unsettlingly calm voice, announced to her and the entire cabin that there was nothing to worry about. They were just experiencing some minor depressurization. The captain's voice then came over the intercom, restating the same explanation. Sophia tried to interject multiple times but was shut down and sent back to her seat. Clearly, everything about the situation was far from normal, but there wasn't much she could do. Eventually, the plane stabilized, and after landing, everyone acted relatively normal. This was a NATO flight with military oversight, which might explain why other passengers seemed hesitant to react differently. Back in 1981, commercial pilots were required to report any unusual aerial phenomena during flights, so there was no way that the massive object she saw wasn't also visible to the cockpit crew, at least for the moments it crossed beneath their flight path. To her knowledge, no report was ever filed about it. Interestingly, years later, there were several other strange reports of cigar-shaped objects seen over the Atlantic Ocean from that exact time period. Pilots reported seeing a massive, torpedo-like craft in a similar manner. However, there didn't seem to be any mention of other aircraft malfunctioning. If something truly caused the plane to experience depressurization, they weren't allowed to talk about it. On October 24, 1989, Chief Petty Officer James Monroe stood at his station aboard the USS Memphis, a nuclear-powered submarine, carefully watching his instruments. They were patrolling about 150 miles off the coast of Florida near Cape Canaveral. The Memphis had been assigned to protect the space program, which meant long hours of methodical patrol patterns in their designated area. Having been a sonar technician for 12 years, Monroe was very familiar with every nuance of his job. Reading his instruments and everything around him, Monroe noticed something unusual. His instruments started giving readings he had never seen before. At first, it was just small anomalies, slight variations in the usual patterns, but within minutes the entire sonar system began acting erratically. Monroe called over his supervisor to take a look, but before they could respond, the radio operator across the room shouted that communications were down. Other crew members reported that the navigation system was offline, and suddenly the reactor control panel lit up with warnings. The submarine's executive officer rushed into the control room, demanding status reports. Before anyone could provide a complete picture, they heard the sound of tanks exploding somewhere in the vessel. An immediate order was given for all hands to report to their emergency stations. The crew initiated emergency servicing procedures, and as the submarine breached the surface, they switched from nuclear power to diesel. Monroe could hear the rain hammering against the hull. But when he looked at the periscope display monitor, something was off. The video feed showed the sky glowing an intense red, like a giant neon sign was hovering above them. Monroe's attention shifted when a junior officer suddenly called out, pointing through the port side window. His voice trembled as he explained there was something out there. Moments later, the captain climbed into the tower and ordered Monroe to use the laser rangefinder to measure whatever they were seeing. Monroe quickly grabbed the rangefinder and called out the readings. The object was 200 meters away at its closest point and about 1,000 meters at the farthest. It was sitting at a 45-degree angle relative to their position. The thing they were looking at was enormous, shaped like an inverted V, and based on the measurements, it had to be over half a mile wide. The crew watched in awe and terror as the massive craft began to move, making a half circle around the submarine. As it passed their stern, every electronic system on the Memphis malfunctioned. The sonar room filled with smoke, and the already damaged communication systems appeared completely fried.
Strangest of all was the effect on the water below the craft. The ocean surface seemed to rise nearly a foot higher than the surrounding water. Around the craft, space and time appeared to distort. The rain behaved unnaturally, defying the typical laws of physics. The object paused behind the submarine and began to glow so brightly that it was almost blinding. Then, in about 15 seconds, it vanished. Almost immediately, most of the Memphis's systems came back online. The captain ordered the crew to switch back to reactor power, and they resumed their mission. However, the radio and sonar systems remained permanently destroyed. 7 hours later, when the Memphis pulled into port, Monroe expected the usual end-of-patrol routine. Instead, armed guards were waiting for them. At the dock, armed guards immediately took Monroe, along with 2 other enlisted men who had been on watch during the incident, into what they called protective custody. The 3 men were separated and placed in different rooms, where Monroe sat for about 3 hours, staring at the wall. Eventually, an Air Force officer walked in, sat across from him and began asking very specific questions about what had happened. Monroe didn't hold back. He described everything in detail, from the measurements to the distortion of space and time around the craft. The officer listened intently, jotting down notes, and when Monroe finished, the officer looked up and told him what had actually happened. According to the officer, what Monroe and his crew had witnessed was nothing more than an exploding weather satellite. He repeated this explanation sternly, and made it clear that this was the story Monroe was to stick to. The officer then pulled out paperwork and informed Monroe that he was being transferred to a new duty station immediately. Monroe wasn't the only one. The entire crew of the Memphis was being reassigned. The captain and all enlisted men on watch were being sent to different stations across the globe. It became evident that they had all seen something they weren't supposed to and were forbidden from discussing it further. The official report stated that the Memphis had experienced electrical malfunctions due to a severe storm, and that the crew had seen debris from a weather satellite breaking apart in the atmosphere. Monroe would go on to serve another 8 years in the Navy before retiring, and he never experienced anything like that again. On the morning of March 15, 1864, a 35-year-old zoologist named Philip Carter sat at his desk inside London's Natural History Museum, carefully examining 2 fossilized lemur skulls under a brass microscope. One of the fossils had been discovered in Madagascar, while the other had been found thousands of miles away in India. As Carter examined every detail, he became increasingly perplexed. The fossils were identical. They belonged to the same species. This discovery made no sense to Carter. Madagascar and India were separated by an entire ocean. He triple-checked the documentation accompanying the fossils, convinced there must have been a mistake about where they had been found. But there wasn't. Frustrated, Carter pushed back from his desk and began pacing his office, which was lined with detailed maps of the world's continents and oceans. He traced his finger along the vast expanse of water between Madagascar and India, struggling to understand how the same species of lemur could have lived in both places. At this point in history, scientists had no concept of plate tectonics or continental drift. They believed that continents had always been where they currently were, and lemurs certainly couldn't swim across an ocean. Later that afternoon, Carter's colleagues found him surrounded by stacks of research papers and journals. He had pulled out every piece of information he could find about similar cases. He explained to them that the only logical explanation was the existence of a massive continent that had once connected Madagascar and India, a continent that had somehow vanished beneath the ocean. While many of his colleagues dismissed the idea as unreasonable, Carter pointed out that they knew almost nothing about what lay at the bottom of the world's oceans. He theorized that a lost continent would solve these mysteries once and for all. He named this hypothetical landmass Lemuria, after the lemur fossils that had led to his discovery. Over the next few months, Carter began publishing his theory in scientific journals, and it quickly gained attention. One of the individuals captivated by the theory was a British Army officer named James Churchwell, who was stationed in India at the time. Churchwell became obsessed with the idea and followed it down a very strange path. In January 1868, while having dinner at a monastery in northern India, Churchwell, who had grown close to one of the high priests during his posting, had an extraordinary conversation that would deepen his obsession with Lemuria. Churchward's mystical revelation. In 1868, James Churchward, a British Army officer stationed in India, had dinner with a high-ranking priest at a secluded monastery. After their meal, the priest invited Churchward to see something extraordinary. He led him into a hidden underground vault containing ancient clay tablets covered in mysterious symbols. The priest explained that these were sacred tablets written in an ancient language called Nagamaya, which only 3 people in the world could still read. These tablets, he claimed, held the true history of mankind, including details about a lost continent called Mu that had once existed in the Pacific Ocean. Over the next 2 years, the priest allegedly taught Churchward to read this ancient language. Churchward claimed the tablets revealed that Mu had been home to an advanced civilization over 50,000 years ago. Its people had harnessed cosmic energy, built flying machines, and even unlocked the secrets of gravity. Fascinated by these discoveries, Churchward later corresponded with Augustus Laplangeon, an archaeologist in Mexico who had found references to Mu in ancient Mayan texts. Together, they speculated that the survivors of Mu's catastrophic sinking had spread to regions like Egypt, Asia, and Central America, forming the basis of early civilizations. By 1884, Churchward returned to England and began publishing his findings. He described Mu as a vast continent, larger than North America, with 7 major cities and a population of 64 million. His claims gained public attention, prompting expeditions to search for evidence of this lost land. Even Thomas Edison reportedly showed interest in the story. However, Churchward's theories began to unravel under scrutiny. In the 1920s, researchers discovered inconsistencies in his accounts. Military records revealed that during the years he claimed to have studied under the Indian priest, he was stationed at a desk job in Burma, far from the monastery. Furthermore, no independent evidence of the Nagamaya language or the tablets Churchward described ever surfaced. When asked to produce the tablets, he claimed they were in storage, but no one ever saw them. By the 1930s, advances in oceanography and geological studies showed no evidence of a sunken continent in the Pacific. Critics dismissed his story as a fabrication, inspired by earlier theories like Lemuria. Churchward's nephew later revealed that he had privately admitted to inventing much of the tale. Despite its debunking, the legend of Mu persisted, a testament to humanity's fascination with lost civilizations and the mysteries of the past. On July 2, 1971, the USS John F. Kennedy, a massive aircraft carrier, was sailing through the calm waters of the Bermuda Triangle, returning to Norfolk, Virginia. After completing a training exercise in the Caribbean, the ship's 5,000 crew members were eager for some downtime before their next deployment. That evening, a communications specialist monitoring the ship's teletype machines noticed something strange. The machines began printing garbled, nonsensical text, and moments later, all shipwide communications failed, an almost impossible event, given the carrier's multiple redundant systems. As the specialist tried to diagnose the issue, commotion broke out on deck. Crew members reported seeing something hovering above the ship. A few communication officers rushed outside and were stunned by what they saw. A massive, glowing object, unlike anything they had ever encountered, suspended silently in the night sky. Witnesses described the object as a triangular craft with pulsating lights along its edges. It appeared to emit a low hum that resonated throughout the ship. As it hovered, several key systems aboard the carrier began to malfunction. Radar screens displayed erratic readings and the navigation system temporarily failed. After several minutes, the craft shot upwards at an impossible speed, vanishing from sight. The ship's systems gradually returned to normal, but the incident left the crew shaken. Upon reaching Norfolk, the event was reported to higher authorities, but the official explanation given was vague. Atmospheric disturbances caused by an electrical storm. For years, crew members shared whispered accounts of that night, but no official investigation or declassified report ever surfaced, leaving the USS John F. Kennedy incident as yet another mystery of the Bermuda Triangle. The mysterious sphere incident. It all began with an unusual sighting, something that no one on board had ever seen before. A glowing, pulsating sphere appeared out of nowhere, hovering silently above the ship. The crew, initially stunned, quickly realized this was no ordinary phenomenon. Suddenly, alarms blared throughout the ship, signaling all hands to return to their stations. Back in the communications center, the equipment remained unresponsive, and the teletype machines continued printing meaningless text. Meanwhile, in the Combat Information Center, radars failed to track anything, compasses stopped working, and even 2 F-4 Phantom jets aboard the carrier couldn't start. The strange phenomenon also seemed to affect the crew. One man became hysterical, screaming that the sphere was God. His behavior turned so erratic and violent that he had to be restrained. Others reported severe headaches and nausea, which were meticulously documented by the ship's on-duty doctor. After about 20 minutes, the sphere vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, and the ship's systems returned to normal. However, the event left an unsettling mark. Days later, as the ship approached Norfolk, the captain addressed the crew through the internal broadcast system. After praising their performance during recent training exercises, he issued a cryptic warning, reminding everyone that certain events aboard naval vessels were classified and not to be discussed with anyone without proper clearance. Technicians who examined the ship's systems after the incident found no malfunctions, no blown fuses, no software glitches, nothing. The equipment seemed to have been affected by an external force that mysteriously disappeared without a trace. Interestingly, many records from that night vanished. The ship's photographer, who documented almost every onboard event, had all his film confiscated. The official deck log contained just a single vague entry about a temporary power fluctuation, and the maintenance logs were missing. Even the carbon copy paper from the teletype machines had been replaced. A week after docking in Norfolk, 2 high-ranking officers from Naval Intelligence came aboard. They gathered all duty officers who had been on watch that night and had them sign thick, non-disclosure agreements. Medical records of crew members affected by the sphere also disappeared from the ship's files. Years later, the communications specialist reported the event to the National UFO Reporting Center, providing an account of the strange events. According to him, several men in trench coats had visited the ship shortly after the incident and interviewed crew members who had witnessed the sphere. However, since not many people knew he had seen it, the specialist was never questioned. To this day, the official explanation of what happened that night over the USS John F. Kennedy remains classified. Despite extensive sonar mapping of the Bermuda Triangle and the surrounding ocean, no definitive answers have been found. Thanks for watching, guys. If you've got thoughts on government secrets, let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more content on similar topics, and check out my related videos for more conspiracy theories and government secrets. See you in the next video.